Hello and welcome to the Michael Mama Show. I'm your host, Michael Mamas, and we're coming to you from Mount Soma, home of the Sri Someshwara Temple in the mountains of western North Carolina. Mountains are beautiful right now. It's been rainy. Started yesterday afternoon. It's going to go through the weekend. But the clouds get so beautiful the way they lie down, between the mountains. It's a beautiful day. Anyway, I think before we get going with the podcast, today's topic, Scotty, how you doing?
I'm good. Yeah,
So,
we're drying out.
oh, that's right. You had tons of rain there in California.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
Yeah, it was amazing.
yeah. North of here, all this rain we've been getting would have been snow, and oh my God, they would have gotten an awful lot of snow. Anyway, before we went on the air, you started talking about, Tucker Carlson interviewed Putin.
Yeah,
And the way it came up is I was telling you about some general that Tucker Carlson interviewed, and how this general was saying the U.S. military is so ill-equipped and untrained. And he gave some historical references to different times when an untrained military went up against a trained military, and that was it. They couldn't fight. And
yeah,
it was interesting. I only saw the first part of it. I mean, the whole thing was, I think, a couple hours. I just watched 15 or 20 minutes at the beginning. But at any rate, I mentioned that to you, Scotty. And then you started saying that you saw the Tucker Carlson interview
yeah.
with Putin. And I haven't seen that yet. And so I asked you about it. And I said, well, wait a minute. I think a lot of people would like to hear it in a nutshell. So what did you think?
Well, it was just interesting, because obviously these days you never know what's really going on.
Mhm.
But from that perspective, he was asking, he asked a few poignant questions. A lot of it was letting, like, you're with a world leader. They're going to kind of.
Scotty, you just got dropped.
He asked him about what kind of
Wait,
scenario.
hang on, Scotty. Scotty, you just got dropped, and I picked you back up
Okay.
when you started quoting what Putin said.
Well, yeah, they were asking, or Tucker asked him, what scenario could you see yourself invading Poland or attacking Poland?
Mm-hmm.
And he said, well, if they attacked us, then I would attack them. We have no interest in like escalating anything, because if we did something like that, it would bring things to the point where, you know, there, you know, basically what everybody is saying here, which is he wants to do this and escalate everything to World War III, and then that could escalate into nuclear. And then why would I want to do that?
Right.
You know,
Yeah. Well, the thing is about that is, they made a deal with Ukraine. Gee, how long ago was that? A few decades ago, I think, a couple decades. And they released Ukraine, and Ukraine was a separate country, and Russia, Soviet Union, whatever it was then at that point in
right?
time, agreed to it.
And
And
so,
so,
so
so now
during
he's turning his back on that. So how can we trust that he'll never invade Poland or anything else? He's
yeah,
getting
but I mean that's just basically suicide. Would we go and attack Russia?
good point. Good point.
You
And
know,
then in all of NATO, he doesn't want to go into war
yeah,
against NATO. That's a good point.
right. So, and then he's like also going back to the talking with Clinton, Bush Senior, all these presidents that he's been involved with. He's made deals where he's like, don't open it to NATO, don't open Ukraine to NATO, don't go any further east, and
Right.
we're cool. Everything is cool. And in fact, he talked about at the beginning. He's like, when these walls come down, and after Boris Yeltsin, they did something to Boris Yeltsin where he kind of just disappeared and said he was a drunk or something. There was a
Yeah.
little story about that. They said he had
That's when the
asked.
deal was.
Yeah, well, he had asked to be like part of the club. Hey, let's, now that these walls are down and we're all one big happy family, let's do some good stuff together. We can, blah blah blah. And he got shut down every time. And then he said, they promised me that they would never go any further east with NATO,
Right.
and they did, right? And then, but
Yeah.
the problem is you get with one president that says it, and then 4 years later, there's another president, or 6 years or 8 years later, and then
Yeah. Historically, I
yeah,
mean, Ukraine's been part of Russia for how long?
yes,
And how strong or weak that argument is certainly up for debate.
and
But then what happened is there's just this one president who uh, made a stupid deal, really, and gave up Ukraine.
right,
And I can understand how Putin would say, "Hey, that's not cool. We're
and
not." That
yeah,
was
and
just
then
that
they
was just
opened
some
up.
drunk.
The first thing that uh, uh, Biden does, and Kamala Harris says, "Yeah, well, let's talk about having Ukraine in NATO." They showed the
Yeah.
clip of her talking about that, and he's
Right.
like,
Right.
and then also he talked about a lot of the people that are there in that I forgot, is it the far eastern region? Is it Donbass or somewhere where there's a lot of ethnic Russians? And he's like, if you
Right. Oh
notice,
yeah, the whole Eastern. Yeah. Right.
he's like, if you
Yeah.
noticed, I went to Kiev and then I pulled back to just the regions that I'm protecting that are actual like Russians
Well,
that
the
want to be
thing,
Russian.
yeah, the thing is too that Ukraine is such a breadbasket. I mean, what did Stalin call it? The gold bank or something?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. I mean,
And
it's
then he
like
goes,
it's like the Midwest in the United States. I mean, it just produces so much wheat and everything,
yeah. And then he's like, well, U.S. thinks that they're these big bullies that are pushing around with their currency and their sanctions and everything else. Look what's
Right.
happened since they've sanctioned us. Okay,
Yeah.
he said now Russia used to be like the 25th or I forgot how far down they were on the European countries in terms of economic. Now they're fifth.
Well, the reason for that is because the U.S. stopped producing oil. The price of oil went way up, and so that is basically funding the Russia to, fight the war.
Yeah, what that was and then they're like,
Oh, yeah.
like
No,
who
that's
blew
all
up,
true.
he's
That's
like,
all
who blew
true.
up the Nord Stream pipeline, right?
Right.
Tucker
Well,
says that to him. He's like, well, if and he did it pretty diplomatic. Putin did. He's like, well, whenever I look at who did something, I looked at who had motive, right, and who has
yeah. Right.
the
Right.
capability of doing it. And he's like, if you
Yeah.
put those two together, and he's like,
Yeah, I get it, Scotty.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's
All right. Well,
yeah,
anyway, let's move on because we got a lot to
sure,
cover today. But that's it in a nutshell, huh?
yeah. It's like,
Yeah.
well,
Yeah. Yeah.
there's more to the story.
Well, that kind of relates to what I was going to say. I was thinking at some point in the podcast, it's in my notes, but somebody ought to write a book, How to Manipulate the Mass Mentality. And of course, a lot of political scientists would say that book has been written many times. But the thing is, I don't think people realize the depth and breadth of that. I mean,
Yeah,
Republican, Democrat, it's just which mass mentality is being manipulated. And
right,
it goes right down to like even the neighborhood level, rumors about people, the state level, rumors about the governor or what have you. It's all just manipulation of mass mentality. And that goes right down, I think, into family dynamics.
sure,
Attitudes get set up. And like I've said in the past, and this is a really profound concept, but a valid one, is that we don't perceive, we project onto. And we have a mindset and an attitude, and that's what we see. And things happen, and they get spun or gaslighted. I don't really know where that phrase came from. Do you gaslight?
Yeah, no, it's been used a lot lately, though.
Yeah, I don't know where it came from. It basically means that it got spun, right?
Yeah.
And that's what people believe, and it's unbelievable. And then there are these things where they interview people on the street, who won the Civil War, and they're like, Japan, or I mean, these people have no idea of the history of the United States, and yet, they're voting, and then it's a mass manipulation thing because it's not even the uneducated, but all the different mentalities. And, they talk about the woke thing and how that's a mentality that's kind of infiltrated. And anyway, that's the state of the world. And this idea of seeing, I mean, that just relates. Actually, I didn't intend it to go this way, but it goes very nicely in the topic of this podcast. Pashya. Pashya means see, and that's something that a guru will say to a student, a disciple, in their efforts to facilitate the evolution of that disciple. But it becomes a very interesting thing because, what does see mean? And anybody who sees is going to see it from their perspective. And so their mentality has been manipulated, not just politically, but in every way. And so that's what they see. So why would a guru tell his disciples see? But so here's what that's about. Because he's good, a real guru. I mean, there's so many phony gurus out there, but a real guru, I mean, he knows and he has wisdom, and he's saying see. And so who's he saying that to? Really, who he's saying it to, you see, as a person evolves, and they talk about different stages of enlightenment. Really, there's just one enlightenment. But as the cobwebs clear, you go through different stages. The analogy, when you go into a cave, it's all dark and you're in the cave, but you can't really see that well. And as the eyes adjust, things become clear. So having said that, in the early stages of walking into that cave, one of the first stages is what they talk about witnessing. And witnessing is like when the field of pure consciousness, you're awake enough to it, but at the same time, the cobwebs haven't cleared all that much. And so you're awake to it. But at the same time, it seems so distant, so separate from relativity, from the world we call the real world that we're functioning in, But there's a stage there where they do become awake to it enough that, like, it's the field of unboundedness, immutable, eternal, ever constant, like that. And so that dichotomy of the motion of relativity and the solidity, the unbounded awareness of pure consciousness, creates a gap because they're so different. And so that's what they call witnessing. Now, a lot of people, just to show you how subtle it is, oh, okay, witnessing. I just learned about witnessing. So great. These are not really my hands moving, and this is not really a computer, and I'm just witnessing all that. Well, that's mood making. And that's not what the guru means when he says Pashya. But what happens is there's a stage when you start to witness where, and you notice it, and it's just like, it's incredible, it's like, whoa, and it's just, you're driving down the street and, and it's not really happening and you're not really driving. I mean, it's kind of, but then see, here's the thing, in all these different levels of consciousness we're going to talk about, there's a habit of focusing on a particular level. And that's the surface, right? It's surface, meaning not just the intellect and the thinking, but also the emotions. All that's superficial in contrast to the depth and to the transcendent, And so we have a tendency then that we notice the witnessing, but then we go about our business. And now in the relative, and we kind of forget about it, which is fine. And then there's a stage you go through where it's like, oh my God, am I still witnessing? And so you put your attention back on it and you check and oh yeah, okay, it's still there, because you feel like that's a feather in your cap, But see, at the same time, there's a value to that dynamic, because what it is, Pashya, see what is. Don't get distracted by the surface and get so lost in the surface that you leave that contact with the depth that you're just starting to make, eyes are just starting to adjust to the no light in the cave, And so that's Pashya. It's just see, because paying attention to it, it kind of reinforces it. Now, we don't get nuts about it, and we don't try to keep our attention on all the time. That's not real. But from time to time, touch into it. Oh, yeah, it's there. To whatever degree it is. We get kind of sidetracked with that, where we think, oh, we're really accomplished because if we put our attention on it, oh, yeah, I'm witnessing. And it's understandable, though. And so then there's another stage as the cobwebs clear, as the eyes adjust to the cave. There's that arena which is called subtle sight, subtle seeing. And what's that about? Subtle sight is it's seeing a more refined level of existence. And that comes in different degrees. But all this that's why they call it the razor's edge. It's such a delicate thing. Because on the one hand, you can get into fantasy, you can get into imagination, you can get into, oh yeah, I'm talking to Shiva and he's talking back. And I mean, and then there are techniques that facilitate that, what's the word? That twisted sort of relationship. There are techniques like taking drugs and people are seeing God fly through the air or whatever, and all that's doing is tearing up the subtle physiology. There are techniques, and this is tragic, but the new kid in town syndrome, somebody comes in there and teaches left-handed tantra, which basically is just a way of ripping the third eye open or twisting it in a way so that all of a sudden you start to get subtler perceptions. But that's such a cost and such a loss and such a distraction that can lead people off for lifetimes, But it's alluring, all of a sudden you see rainbows flying through the air, and if you listen to a description of the real deal, you're like, oh yeah, I see colors too, and oh yeah, I see auras, and oh yeah, I see all that. So it's a very subtle thing, and that's why the approach, the technique that's employed, has to be natural. But the natural process of the blossoming of the sprouting of a flower, a bud, and then the flower, it's a process. And people get impatient. And so if somebody comes along and rips open their third eye and all of a sudden they see lights and everything, and so, yeah, I see lights now too and all that, then, they go for it. So that's all tragic, really. So the reality of subtle sight, it is there. And one of the things, if you're doing a proper meditation and you're going about the path, in a responsible way, the truth of the matter is subtle sight is subtle. It's not a, Fruit Loops or juicy fruit gum, type of commercial where there's all these colors and everything, and kind of like you'll see on kids' cartoon shows, It's not like that. It's subtle. So that's the first thing. And it's so subtle that when you start that first stage, when you start to open to it, when you start to see, it's more like, am I going crazy? I mean, is this real? Or is this just my imagination? But then things will happen along the way where you get validation. One of the easier ways to get validation is, and we all do this, you're talking to somebody and all of a sudden you kind of see the in the course of the conversation, you see a kind of a switch in their brain. You can kind of sense it. Do you know what I'm talking about there, Scotty?
Right.
Yeah, it's just like, oh, you can see the light go on, and teachers will talk about that. How one of the things they love about teaching is when a kid finally understands a concept or maybe a mathematical thing or something, the light goes on, and they just lighten right up. Well, that's subtle sight, really. And it's a beginning stage of subtle sight that most all of us can experience. When we see that, we see it. And so, then there can become other things that are more subtle than that. And that's where you get into the arena of, wait, I don't want to sound too far out, but I mean, the personified correlates to things, the devas, even the earth spirits, all that is real. But by and large, when people think they're perceiving it, they're off in la la land. But you see, even then, when it is actually happening, uh, noticing it and getting past that thing where, oh, I'm crazy, I got to ignore it. No, that's wrong. I got to shut it down. It's kind of like there's that subtle level there of doubting the doubt, and so that's another process. And when you can get sometimes something will come along where you get some degree of validation. You might be in Benares and you might be looking at the ghats and where they cremate the bodies, and you might see Kali dancing around the ghats there, and it's like, am I crazy? But then you might say to somebody, oh, I see Kali there, and they say, well, that's very interesting. They say, because everybody calls Benares the city of Shiva. Really, it's the city of Kali. That's just one example. And so there's some validation. Or you might look at a certain mountain and way in the distance across a valley, and you might see what looks like Parvati. And she's straddling a mountain like that, way across this very distant valley, or way up in the Himalayas. And then you find out, well, that is where the Parvati temple is, which is a cave. So you just saw it, So you see, a lot of it is starting to know where to look, or finding it within yourself. Because I used to teach hands-on healing, and how to feel chakras and all that. It's easy, really. It sounds far out, but that's the point. Once you get onto it, and very commonly students, oh, I can't get it. Oh, there's, what's my problem? I'm no good at this or whatever. But once they get it, they're like, oh, well, if I knew that's what I was looking for, I would have been able to do it right away. And that whole thing is in the arena of what I call learning to feel. Learning to feel. I've had a lot of chiropractors go through that program. And the best chiropractor I know of, and I've seen a lot of chiropractors through the years, attributes his abilities to the fact that I taught him how to feel before he went to chiropractic school. So, and so what is that? Pashya, see or feel, that's how all that works. Now, there's an interesting thing here, and this is where it really becomes critically important in a person's evolution, is they've gone into what they call Brahman consciousness, where, and I've talked about this, where you look at the pillow and I am that pillow, and you look at the camera, I am that camera, or you look at the computer, I am that computer. And then that computer is one with God. That computer is God. That computer is the source of everything. And you think you're going crazy in a way when it's first happening. What is this? And so then, even at that stage, even at that level, you engage in the world and your attention isn't there. It's not that it's gone. It's just your attention is on, what's for dinner. And so then that's when the guru will say, Pashya, Pashya, see. Because there's even one of the Brahma Sutras, it's one of the first 10, I think. I don't have it right in front of me, but basically it's saying it's through practice. See. So you work with it, and you get more familiar with it, you get more comfortable with it, and through that, it becomes more alive and more integrated. It's the best word, in your physiology, because ultimately, what happens is the surface of life and the depth all become one. You see, and and then these levels of consciousness that seem so far out. Shiva is the silent witness. And see, then it ceases to be, oh yeah, this witness value of early enlightenment. Then it becomes he who has no name, and he's the eternal witness. No opinion, no comment, no direction given. He who has no name. And so you see that. And then things like Aham Vishvam, I am the universe. At first, am I crazy or what? But then see. Oh, yeah. Well, that's what that is. I'm not crazy. So Pashya, Now, there's in the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, there's dharana, jhana, and samadhi, and dharana means, it's generally translated, I believe it's like concentrate or focus. But see, that can really mess up the manner in which a person practices Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, because they turn into a form of concentration. And that's not what it means. What it really means is effortless concentration. And I think if you're meditating, you probably have had that experience where it's just like, you're just there. And it's almost like you're locked in. Dharana, effortless concentration. And then when you do the Yoga Sutras, jhana, samadhi, like that, then you take it to the depth. And that's when the predicted results from Maharishi Patanjali come out. And by doing, Sanyama, which is dharana, jhana, samadhi, doing the technique, when you do the technique together, you do that on moon, and you see the shape of the universe, and he has all the predicted results. This is just Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. Talks about the different sutras, what the results are. And so then, doubt the doubt. Am I going crazy, or did I just see the shape of the universe? I'm going crazy, or did I just see galaxies? But that's how the whole thing works. And another interesting point here is that we all have that interconnectedness. It's just a matter of how clear it is, how full it is, or how lost we might be to the surface value, or how lost we might be, to what we were talking about a little bit ago, Scotty, about like the programmed mind, the, how do we put it? There's just a perspective and that's it. The mass mentality, we get indoctrinated into the mass mentality, but these deeper channels are available to us. And that's why a lot of times science fiction writers or fantasy writers will touch into these very abstract notions that on a rational basis, if we're identified with the surface, that doesn't make any sense. That's crazy. And just one example of it is, who was it? I can't remember who wrote the thing about these associations. It's a cognition of the Veda. But anyway, it talks about bats and how bats, and so that now we're getting in the arena of omens, and right away, people will shut down to that because it's just not relating to the indoctrinated mindset. But one idea is that, bats are a very negative influence, and have bats in the house, for example. If they get in the house or something, it's not considered a good influence. It's not considered a good omen. And so what a beautiful example, really, of how we know that in our own inner psyche. And really, if you see bats flying through the air or whatever, or if you ever, there's something that you can feel that's like, man, this is weird. And what does that relate to in the fantasy world of when somebody lets that subtle sense be unleashed and not suppressed? Wizard of Oz, flying monkeys. What are the flying monkeys? Well, they're an ominous sign, right? Related with negativity, or the Wicked Witch of the North, or whatever it was. Too bad they made it the Wicked Witch of the North, because the North is an auspicious direction. Anyway, flying monkeys relate to that intuitive sense of bats. And we have, there's so much of that sort of thing going along, but to familiarize yourself with it and to get accustomed to what actually is, it's not so easy to do. You meditate, and if you can get validation from a reliable source, but unfortunately, usually the validation that's out there is from somebody who's ripped open their third eye. And so the whole thing is just highly elusive, the razor's edge, Pashya. Anything else, Scotty?
No, I think you.
I think that covers it. Beautiful quote from Buckminster Fuller. There's nothing in a caterpillar that tells you it's going to be a butterfly. I thought that was beautiful. Saw a nice quote from Winston Churchill also. There's no doubt that it is around the family and the home that all the greatest virtues, the most dominating virtues of human, are created, strengthened, and maintained. It's in the home. It's really interesting that there seems to be an assault on the family dynamic, doesn't there, Scotty?
Yeah.
In the educational system, for example. When I was a kid, you went to school, you learned reading, writing, and arithmetic, and then you went home, and that's where your value system was, But now there's so much going on in the educational system that's just a manipulation of the mass mentality. Anyway, Pashya, just see what is. It's meditate, evolve, and protect your mind. All right. If there's nothing else, Scotty, I think that's enough for this week. Thanks, everybody, for listening, and we will talk with you again next week.